A very good afternoon to all of you. Those who are watching from India, good morning to our friends in Europe, and good evening to our friends in Australia and the Southeast. My name is Raj Kumar. I'm the founding Vice Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University and Dean of Jindal Global Law School. We are on the first day of the Global Law School Summit and entering into the third thematic session of the summit entitled Global Law Deans, the Changing Patterns of Law School Administration. We have with us a very distinguished group of law school deans, Professor Dr. Nick James, Executive Dean and Co-Director, Faculty of Law, Bond University in Australia, Professor Penelope, Elise, Mathew, Dean, Faculty of Law, the University of Auckland in New Zealand, Professor Dr. Natalie, Skead, Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Western Australia in Australia, and Professor Dr. Maman Suherman, Dean of the Faculty of Law, Jenderal, Soedirman University, Indonesia. My apologies for not pronouncing it accurately. It is indeed my proud privilege to welcome all of you to this, what is promises to be a fascinating conference. Now, Law Dean, if I go by a textbook definition in the luxury of generalizing, but at the cost of conceptual clarity, can be referred to as the guardian of the law school. Almost a caretaker of everything associated with the law school. Law deans are duty-bound to guarantee the Aristotelian happiness, the supreme good all around the institution. They shall know that their school in its totality, faculty interest, student interest, staff interest, profession interest, and society's interest. They shall also balance these multi-stakeholder interests. The sum total of these interests is the supreme good of the law school. The dean is, as Stanton Wheeler referred to, Dean Abe Goldstein, as Dean of Law and Life. But all of us, deans and non-deans, will agree that deanship cannot be explained through simple abstractions. The image of the proverbial law dean since the days of Dean Langdale has changed with spatio-temporal transformations like globalization. In fact, every dean has to have the Langdalian ingenuity and insights, but also had to hold off against uncertainties and unpredictabilities of the global times. But the deans did sail through the tempests of late modernity with only their ideas, determination, and will as their aid. The image of the global dean is that of a fighter leading at the forefront, and on the other side are temporal twists and turns. The global deans find themselves in a dialectic relationship with ideas, claims, criticisms, and advices. The dean in dialectic constantly self-perfects oneself and the institution. The institutional policies are their dialectical sides. The grammar of administration sets the dialectical rules, and maximizing institutional happiness is the dialectical goal. Now, the global law deans do not revel in ivory towers of administration. Rather, they fight on the ground with their foot soldiers being available for everyone. Such is the demand of uncertainties and unpredictability of these times that the impact is always felt on the ground. The global deans, law deans on the feet and on the ground avoids escalation of costs, fetching speedy and efficient response to challenges. Global dean is also a scholar. They shall possess scholarly qualities of inquisitiveness, passion for truth, intellectuality in speech and thought, patience, and most importantly, modesty before knowledge. Their scholarly qualities and ingenuity are needed in policy brainstorming with students, in making witty rejections to unreasonable demands, in educating the second layer of law school leadership, in ensuring fairness in decisions, in describing, explaining, and rationalizing exceptions, in hearing out concerns, making the listener feel important, in taking concerns on board for study and analysis, in setting highest ethical standards for oneself and the school, and to read, think, write, teach, and publish above everyone else in the school. It is these qualities which prepare and enable global law deans to govern law schools effectively in a regime which demands highest levels of accountability. With that introduction, let me move to my fascinating group of law deans around the world to begin this discussion. Let me start with a question in the form of what we are all familiar with, the classic image of a global law dean. Perhaps not so relevant today, is that of a Noah taking the proverbial ark against the tempest of a fallen modernity and a rising post-modernity. Seldom we speak about their own self-discoveries, about which we should have spoken even before we speak about their being saviors. In fact, the self-discovered from the unfamiliar conditions, persevered against many odds, and obtained their global identity and the sense of situationality. My question is, how can we conceptualize this self-discovery of global law deans such that we break these images and simplistic similes and get the concept of global law dean in its totality? Let me begin by asking this question to Professor Nick James.
Thank you, Professor Kumar, for that wonderful introduction. After listening to your wise words about the role of the contemporary dean, I'm feeling quite heroic. You certainly make us look good. So thank you very much for that. So it's an interesting first question, sort of getting us to reflect upon our own journey of self-discovery in these very challenging times. I think I'll begin by observing that the role of the dean has always been extremely challenging. The dean is positioned between the senior management, the leadership of the university, and the troops on the ground, as you refer to them, the staff, the academics, and the professional staff who are actually in many ways doing the work. And we are in between those two. And sometimes that can be extremely challenging when our leaders at the university are frustrated with what the academics perhaps are up to. We are the ones that we are seen as representing the academics, and so we have to defend them and take responsibility for that. But at the same time, if our academic colleagues are frustrated or annoyed with senior management of the university, then we are seen as part of the senior management of the university, and we represent and have to defend those interests as well. So we are beset from above and below, and we have to juggle those responsibilities often simultaneously. So that's always been a challenge for a dean. I think even prior to our current global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, the role was already becoming much more complex and much more challenging. I'm probably less concerned by the rise of postmodernism than I am by the rise of corporatism and managerialism. Long gone are the days when the role of dean could be was simply something that the professors in the law school took turns doing every year or two. They just swapped the role around, and it was a part-time job that had a little bit of administrative responsibility, but it wasn't something that was what it is today, which is a full-time or even more than full-time role with high levels of managerial and executive expectation attached to the role. It's not something that an academic can just do on the side anymore. It's a full-time responsibility. So that the role was already becoming much more complex. And then, of course, last year, everything became so much more difficult and so much more complicated because, while the role of academic and the role of dean is a complex one and a challenging one, in the academy, at least, things tended to move relatively slowly. But that all changed in the last couple of years. Change has come very, very quickly. It is becoming more and more difficult to plan effectively because of the uncertain, at least immediate future. And so I look back now on the challenges of pre-2020 and think, wow, how easy we had it before we had to deal with all of the challenges associated with the pandemic. So the journey of self-discovery, I think, is a journey that everybody in higher education has to go upon, but particularly deans. For me, almost the daily crises that we've had to deal with have forced me to often ask and reflect upon, well, why am I doing this? This is so difficult. This is so stressful. This is so challenging. And I've had to remind myself of the reasons why I became a scholar and an academic in the first place. And when I remind myself of the big picture, the important role that law schools and lawyers play within the community, the important role of research and scholarship, when I remember not to lose sight of those things, then the daily crises become more manageable. And I remember that ultimately, as a dean, as a group of academics, as an institution, we are first and foremost responsible for doing good in the world. And we still need to find ways to do that, even when we're dealing with, budgets and unpredictable strategic planning in the face of closed borders and the like. So as long as we occasionally step back as deans and think, what's the important thing here? What is the importance of the academy, of the university, of law? Everything becomes much more manageable.
Thank you so much, Dean James, for that. Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, that's fine. That's
Thank you, Dean James, for setting the tone for this conversation. I'm going to quickly move to Dean Mathew. Dean Mathew, in addition to that question, I would like you to briefly reflect on the balancing role between being an administrator and a scholar. You may add that to your response as well.
Yes, well, I think the balance is usually tipped very firmly in favour of being a leader and an administrator. I have, managed to keep my hand in with a little bit of research during both deanships. So I've been a dean in Australia and now a dean in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But on the whole, one becomes the chief cheerleader, I think, for your colleagues. And it's about mentoring early career researchers and encouraging people in their research efforts rather than your own research. Although I think it's important still to set a good example by trying to continue to publish. I must say I agreed with all of Nick's description of the difficulties of being a dean. And one thing that struck me as he was talking, it is, as you've said, Raj, a voyage of self-discovery, how we manage ourselves in difficult situations and how we manage others. And it does strike me that often you don't have any training for this job. We tend to look at examples of deans who we've admired. So one I would think of would be the late, great Michael Coper at the Australian National University. And I think I learned a lot from him. But it's not until you actually take on the challenge of the role that you realise exactly how enormous it is and how challenging it is, and that it is indeed a journey of self-discovery, I think.
Thank you very much, Dean Mathew, for that. And I do agree with you that Michael was a fantastic example and remains a great source of inspiration for me personally as well. Let me move to, Professor Skead. Professor Skead, one of the things that Dean Mathew referred to is about the balancing act. Do you think that the generation of students expecting quick and immediate results and responses has dramatically changed the entire role and administration and expectations from a dean, in addition to whatever else you would like to refer?
That's a really interesting question. And I should just say, Professor Kumar, unlike Nick, following your introduction, I wasn't feeling particularly heroic. I was feeling more utterly inadequate and ill-equipped to do this job. And I think it comes back to something that you and I think Penelope may have alluded to, and that is oftentimes deans are not trained. So there are very few career deans. In most instances, a dean it's more of a service role, and a dean steps up from the pool of more senior academics in a law school, and so that, and I should say that was my experience, and which makes the path of self-discovery very, very steep indeed, and incredibly rocky, and that's even without a pandemic thrown in just for fun. I think students have always had high expectations. We are seeing, and as a parent of two university children, so they are admittedly in postgraduate, there is certainly, there has been a shift, although it's been a slow shift, I think, to a sort of a consumer mindset for students, and with that comes consumer type demands, and it's something that I have to remind my colleagues of regularly, that it's the students that are paying our salaries. The research is wonderful and so critically important, but ultimately students are paying our salaries, and I'm not sure that their expectations, frankly, are unreasonable. They are paying a lot of money. They're working really, really hard, and in a law school they have aspirations of entering a profession, well equipped and competent, and it is our obligation to provide an environment in which they can become all it is that they wish and need to become. It does, I think, increasingly in academia there are administrative burdens, not just on deans, but on all academic staff. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think our jobs are becoming increasingly difficult and less perhaps noble than they used to be, and oftentimes it just, and I think Nick referred to this, it just feels like an absolute grind. But our role, I think, as the leader of the school is to support our staff and our students through that grind, and it is a grind both for staff and students, not just for staff, to support them through that. And it's something I've been saying in the last year or so, as our university is going through some difficult times, really sandbagging the school. But that can wear you down. So I do think it is really important for deans to have this opportunity to actually share with other deans and have a community of law deans, both within our own states and countries, but also internationally.
Thank you very much, Professor Skead. In fact, one of the purposes of this summit is also to promote that sense of community that you talked about. Let me move to Dean Suherman. Dean Suherman, I want to shift gears a bit. One of the things that people have talked about today, both in terms of organizations, institutions, even corporations, companies, business enterprises, even academic institutions, is the kind of, let's say, the type of level of happiness that prevails in those institutions. Now, you may agree that happiness, as much as it is a significant index of robust global societies, is also an important indication that a law school has an ecosystem congenial for legal education. Now, what would be the considerations before a global law dean in making law schools happy? How their experiences and experiments in self-discovery and the resulting global outlook would help them in creating, quote unquote, happy spaces and happy work environments and happy outcomes?
Okay, thank you for very interesting questions. So luckily for me, it's very nice and good questions, because yes, our lives should be always in balance and also should be happy. Even the situations is now still we concerned with the pandemic times. I would like to elaborate in this respect that as the dean, we need to facilitate all the stakeholders, particularly for students and also lecturers, and also the students' parents as well. We need to facilitate everything should be available, and also we need to protect all the interests, particularly for the student. Yes, I think in facilitating that needs, I think deans should be aware for some kinds of facilities that should be available in the campus. Yeah, even we still in the pandemic time, we should provide the equipment, the sophisticated equipment to facilitate the student in terms of how to serve them in giving, delivering lecture, also in offline campus, inline lecture, also offline lecture. So now in Indonesia, in our campus as well, the blended class already conducted since 2 months ago. So it's getting well, and every student's happy in the campus. And also we also offer them in global perspectives. Yes, many things can be accessed, particularly for the student who want to go abroad and also want to take further studies in many countries in our partner universities. Yes, I'm as the dean already strongly very commit to provide them the opposite university who can collaborate with our university, with our faculties. Yes, I think from my agenda during my deanship in my faculty of law, there are many students who already follow these programs, and also I asked them that they are very happy with the program, and also the parents as well support them very well, because yes, as we know, during our teenagers and also we're still young enough, so we are very happy with it, that kind of opportunity to go abroad, to look many things in the world and other world. So I think it's good investment for our teenager, our students. Yes, that's the point, that I already opened the international program for the students. Then it's already the third year until now. We make more collaboration, including with Jenderal Global University. But unfortunately, all the programs still should be postponed for the time being. Because of what? Yes, because of the pandemic still should be, we get a lot of them. I think that's my program run very well so far.
Thank you very much, Dean Suherman, and we had a very interesting round of discussions. For all those who are watching us live on Facebook and YouTube, please continue to do so, and do send in your questions. At the end of this session, I'm going to take some of those questions to our distinguished panelists. Let me move to Nick. Nick, now the shift in global conditions also changed the very pattern of routine law school functioning. And you quite rightly said that there was a point of time when deanships were rotational. Many global practices generally exercised in socio-political spaces found place in law school culture as well. Now, this has resulted in a number of demands and expectations from law schools. First, there was a large demand for transparency, which certainly requires a culture of better communication. Second, the demand for spaces of freedom of thought, speech, criticism, and dissent. Third, to make the school of a regime of mutual trust. Fourth, to maintain standards of excellence. Now, do you think there's a single approach to responding to all these demands, or that the global dean shall adopt a multi-pronged approach to have, fulfill different stakeholders' expectations?
I wish the answer was that there was a nice, simple strategy that a dean could adopt in any situation in order to produce the happy outcomes we were talking about earlier. But sadly, that is not the case. The dean needs to be many things for many different people and many different stakeholders. And no, I don't think any single style works in all situations. Sort of building on the previous question about the role of the dean in creating a happy space, the challenge that we've already touched upon is that there are so many people that we need to keep happy. The university management itself, the students, of course, the various stakeholders, the local legal profession, the admission authorities, the judiciary, and of course our own staff. And those different stakeholders require different approaches and different styles of response in order to keep them happy. So no, I don't think there's a single approach to responding to these challenges that's going to work in every situation. I think picking up on those 4 points that you were referring to, the notion of spaces of freedom, I think, is something that is receiving a lot of attention at the moment. Partly because academic freedom, the freedom of the scholar to pursue their line of inquiry, no matter the consequences, is something that's always been highly valued. But in the contemporary climate, it has become something of a hot topic. Partly because the pandemic forced universities and deans as well to, on occasion, adopt a very different style of leadership. We're in crisis. It was an emergency. People just have to, for example, shut down your classes and learn how to teach online as quickly as possible. And we didn't have time to be transparent or consult or debate these changes in strategy, which we would normally do in quieter times. We had to impose our will upon our colleagues. And I think during the crisis, during the emergency, certainly in the early part of COVID-19, people were extraordinarily cooperative. Everybody stepped up and accepted the direction of their leaders. But as the pandemic has dragged on, I mean, more and more academics are saying, no, wait, what happened to transparency? What happened to consultation? Slow down. We need to return to a more an approach that brings everybody into the conversation rather than just a top-down management style. So I think more and more academics now are pointing out that we need to return to a style of law school leadership, law school management that is more consultative and inclusive than the emergency dictates that we adopted last year. So I might let some of the other speakers respond to this, because I think it's an extremely interesting question.
Thank you, Nick. Dean Mathew, you may want to answer that, but I will also add one more component to it, shifting gears a bit. This is about something that all of us are conscious of. Now, I know that University of Auckland is proud about the fact that it's a global university. So my question to you is, in global times, it is essential for law schools to evince that global approach. Now, we know that a law school becomes global, not just by calling itself, rather it becomes global through adopting global characters in the elements of a law school and global practices in its functioning, including its global curriculum, its global pedagogy, a global faculty, and globally accepted practices. So my question to you is that, how does one pursue this global ambition? What frameworks are needed to function as a global law school? What outcomes do the global perspective and global practices obtain?
Well, I mean, I think there are some things in common that we want to see, exchanges with other universities. We participate in international debates. We're writing in the international literature. We aspire to have students or graduates who are able to operate in a globalized world. They're culturally competent. They're able to work in many jurisdictions. So I think that's right. There is this global aspiration. I mean, interestingly, and this is probably true for a lot of places, but certainly for Aotearoa New Zealand, we're having some very interesting debates about redressing the colonial foundations of the country and drawing more strongly on the foundational document, the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and really thinking about the pre-existing legal system. So in many ways, we're not just trying to be global, we're trying to focus on our responsibilities to our local communities. And the profession is engaging in that as well. So the Council of Legal Education has recently adopted a resolution saying that we must try to implement tikanga Māori, the customary law of the land, in all of the core subjects that we need to offer as part of a law degree. So I think there are some quite interesting tensions there. And this harks back to some of the earlier panels during the conference, that there are these interesting creative tensions between the global and the local. If we're concerned about issues to do with equality, for example, or Black Lives Matter, we've got to be serving our local communities well and not be just caught up in the global sphere and join a global elite. We've got to provide education that serves the needs of the country or the place that we're in.
Thank you very much, Dean Mathew. Dean Skead, I think you may reflect on both those aspects. You may unmute yourself. That happens to be the most important line since March 2020.
Indeed, and you would have thought that 18 months later it would no longer be necessary, but clearly it still is. I couldn't agree more with Penny, and I think we're seeing that certainly across the country in Australia. And actually, when when I talk to colleagues in Canada and also the US, I do think we're starting to really see this recognition that it's important to look inwards, fix our own backyard before we can start looking outwards. And we're certainly doing that at our law school with our indigenization of our Juris Doctor program. But I think what that does is, you know, we have, and I suspect in many law schools, a fairly typical and very familiar cohort of law students, generally quite privileged. And focusing on local issues, I think, is the first step to appreciating that there is diversity out there, that not everybody lives in the same way that we do, not everybody experiences the law in the same way we do, or interacts with the law in the same way that we do. And I'm speaking here we as in our students. And so that's really the first step to our students then being able to look outwardly well beyond their local context, and understanding the diversity of experiences with the law and in the law that pervade the entire globe. So every continent and every country on every continent. So for us, I think that has become an imperative.
Thank you very much, Dean Skead. Dr. Suherman, I would like you to respond to that question, but also to briefly talk about to what extent even during these times, it is important for your law school to connect with other institutions.
Okay, thank you for your questions. I think even today is still uncertain time, this uncertain condition because of pandemic time. But I do believe that we need to still to stay connected with other institutions, our partner, both in national or international collaborations. Because as a global law dean, I think we have, and also we need a kinds of open mindset, how to bring our school, our law school, to be more global. And also we need kind of recognition from other institutions. So today, our faculty is still concerned how to prepare our international accreditation. It's kind of one of our responsibility as a legal scholar and also as dean, because it's our responsibility not only for our students, for our teaching staff, but also we have to be responsible to our rector, because we always signed the contract with our rector that we have to perform well every year to year, and always evaluated every time. So to me, that's the global commitment and global concern. We need to bring our institution to still connected with other institution, even just with in some ways today we need to change the method, because of we are impossible to visit each other, and also it's kind of difficulties today. Even from the government, it's quite enough budget to travel to go to somewhere and to visit our university partner. But on the other hand, it's about the prohibition that is still not allowed to go to other countries because of the restriction today still tight enough, and it's not possible for the time being. So maybe yes, next year, maybe not too long time enough, I think we can realize to make it real, our collaboration, and to make still contact each other, and to make better collaboration in teaching and learning, and also in the research. I think that's my view in the future.
Very much. Thank you very much, Dean Suherman. All right, Dean James, let me push that question back to you, but also to say, now we know that collaborations on a global scale help people to have a transnational and comparative perspective to legal education. Now, while I would like you to briefly articulate the considerations for a global law school to set up collaborations, It is also true that when we are in a crisis, there is a natural tendency to look inwards, to not to be concerned so much about those partnerships and collaborations, but to set our own home in order. Now, under those circumstances, how do you, as Dean, work towards retaining the character of a global law school, yet be conscious of the natural tendency to be looking inwards so that you end up having the right balance for the future?
That's an excellent question, and it's one you're right in that in a crisis like this, the temptation is to both look inwards and focus upon keeping your current students as happy as possible, and perhaps the restrictions on international travel mean that the opportunities for collaboration and creating international networks are in some ways lessened. Although the fact that we've all gone online now, and the fact, for example, that we're all here this afternoon from all over the planet right now, we're all connecting on a global level thanks to the benefits of these technologies. But just a few comments in relation to what strategy a school that aspires to be a global law school should adopt. The first is that there's always pressure from the institution, from the university, to establish international partnerships, often driven by a desire to attract international students to the law school. And the danger is that sometimes we or other law schools end up setting up partnerships that aren't sincere partnerships. We are often given KPIs, key performance indicators, that there are pressures upon us to create relationships with other institutions, and sometimes the temptation is to create a memorandum of understanding or agreement that it's got our names on it. We've created a partnership, done, and that's it. And it's not a sincere relationship. And so very little actually comes from it, other than showing our vice chancellors that we were able to negotiate a partnership. For me, the genuine international collaborations are not from university to university, but from scholars to scholars. When you have academics who are genuinely connecting and working together, often on collaborative research projects, that's when you end up with a genuine partnership between institutions, and not the box ticking exercise that we often find ourselves falling into.
Thank you very much, Dean James. Dean Mathew, you may briefly reflect on that, but what I really wanted to ask you is about what we talked earlier about, the idea of safe spaces. Now, safe spaces is part of any system in global society, and law school is no exception. Identifying safe spaces requires greater degree of social awareness and sensitivity on the part of the dean, a sort of insight to understand the nature and extent of representation social subjects, including members of the law school community, require. The law school dean, who is setting such spaces, must also have the insight to know the extent of freedom in free spaces, such that freedom does not infringe upon others' rights, dignity, and safety. Now, what are the factors a global law dean should be mindful of when carving out and creating such safe spaces? How can safe spaces be sustained, and how can we keep the dynamics of them balanced?
Okay, so many questions to answer. So one thing I actually want to ask, because I'm curious, and it goes back to something that Nick was talking about in terms of freedom of expression and why there's been particular pressure around that. I'm very curious to know whether, for example, in India, you've been having similar sorts of debates as we have been having in Australia, to a lesser extent, perhaps New Zealand, and certainly in the United States, where I think governments have held a view that universities have somehow no longer been the bastion of free speech that they once were, and they've become rather left-leaning, and they're full of censorship, and then they need to have codes of conduct on free expression. I think that concern is actually wildly overblown. And in Australia, there was, of course, the French report that said, no, freedom of expression is alive and well in Australian institutions. Carolyn Evans and Adrienne Stone wrote a wonderful book, Open Minds, where they took a similar view that actually it's alive and well. So I suppose part of my answer is a university is about a place of robust debate. It should be about allowing both sides of an issue or multiple sides to flourish. But we do have responsibilities. There are always going to be limits on free speech. We don't encourage hate speech, for example. It is also an institution of learning, and people have to be comfortable in order to be able to learn well. We have all sorts of rules around speech in classes, for example. We don't allow everybody to talk at once. No one is going to learn anything in that sort of situation. As a human rights lawyer, I guess I just go back to basic principles around free speech and the balance of rights and how it depends on a context. If we're in a classroom as opposed to a public lecture, there will be slightly different rules applying in those settings. I hope that goes some way to answering your question. You might want to tease out a bit more from us, though.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dean Mathew. I think the question that the response and the question you asked is real in the sense that Indian academic institutions have also faced these challenges. Although I have been maintaining for a very long time that dogmatism that emerges out of any form of political ideology, be it from the extreme left or the extreme right, has not helped academic institutions. And I think, and this actually puts us into an even more difficult situation as administrators as to how we as institutional heads need to charter those territories. And my own view is that while we, as an academic head, we have to protect the academic freedom of our faculty members, as well as the academics and researchers and scholars and teachers. But at the same time, as institutional leaders, we need to exercise a greater degree of responsibility when it comes to our own writings and utterances, so long as we are holding those positions, as that might end up being much more complex when it comes to holding those positions of leadership and then taking ideological positions that may not necessarily be. In some ways, it's a responsibility that we have already taken, and it's a luxury that we will have to postpone for a while when we end up going back to a non-deaning situation. But I would love to hear Dean Skead's view on the same issue, because I do believe that all of us are facing these issues in our own respective societies with varying degrees of intense engagement.
Thank you. Yes, and I have the benefit, I suppose, of having the former Chief Justice French, who led that inquiry and the report, as our Chancellor and an adjunct in the law school. So we've been having this conversation for some time, and I may be mistaken, but I think it was a particular incident that occurred within our university. It was an event that had been booked externally, and it was only a week before the public event was to run that the university, the institution, realized what the subject matter was. And it is a very, very careful and delicate balancing act, because we have so many, arguably we have so many disparate groups to whom we have this obligation to create safe spaces. Personally, and having been involved in those discussions at the time in our law school, my personal approach, and it's certainly the position I take within our school, is just that first principle, immutable principle of first do no, and I have adapted it a little, we've had to adapt it a little, but first do no irreparable harm, and which I suppose raises an entirely different and perhaps even more complex issue. But I think if one asks oneself that question, perhaps the way forward becomes a little clearer when we're making those, those difficult decisions. Is there anybody who may, as a result of what it is we say or write or do, events that we may support, are there people or are there individuals who may suffer irreparable harm as a result of this? And if there are, well, therein lies your guidance, I think.
Thank you very much, Dean Skead, for that. Maybe I'll take up that question with Dean Suherman too. And I also want to briefly discuss that to what extent, your own law school faculty members are encouraged to write op-eds in newspapers and beyond the scholarly writings, and how it ends up being perceived. For example, in our university, a number of our academics, besides being scholars and writing journals and other academic works, they also appear on television, and they are on public domain and public discourse. So it'll be nice to hear from you how within your own university and your law school, these things are encouraged or somewhat seen indifferently, or how it works. It'll be nice to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. I think Indonesian society has always live in diversity, because we live in a very huge country, and many languages, and also many belief systems, etc., and also political parties as well. So in my university, that our leader, our rector, and from the government provide us sufficient budget to fund some kind of research and also publication. That's enough budget, I think. But the problem for us is about how to manage in a short time. We should execute the program, yeah, in short time period, because you know that the accountability of government budget is quite rigid. It's quite not flexible enough to have kind of accountability to the government. But the academic activity, such kind of publication or research and etc., we need a long time to execute the program. Such is the main problem in our country, because 1 year should be the budget should be finished in the end of the year. Like today in November, we should expand the budget back to zero. So, and then in this case, I would like to elaborate a little bit about the diversity in my faculty. How to our faculty members have kind of open mindset, and also make more tolerance to something different from one belief system, or also culture, and also values in our society. So it's kind of something it's quite common in our country, in Indonesia, because every day we live in many multi-ethnics, and also many languages and many belief systems, and also many organizations who can contribute to our faculty. Yes, like that.
Thank you very much, Dean Suherman. Of course, we are now slowly coming to the end of this program. I have already received a number of questions, and I'm going to take up a few. Over to you, Nick. The person who's asking, Sujata Newton, she's asking, what steps can a law school take to make its presence felt globally? And are there specific examples? Further, how must it incorporate the global conscience in its internal governance?
Wonderful questions. I don't think there are easy answers to them. I think, how does a law school position itself globally? I think it goes back to the basics. I mean, law schools are first and foremost institutions responsible for teaching the next generation of lawyers and engaging into research and scholarship as part of the great project of preserving and enhancing human knowledge. And I think it's excellence in those two fields that's going to attract global attention. So whether it's a law school that defines itself in terms of global best practice in terms of teaching and the student experience, which is something that my particular law school aspires to, or whether it's a law school that goes down the path of trying to facilitate world-class or above world-class research by its scholars, and thereby attracting global attention by way of its research excellence. So my response to that first question is to take it back to the basics: good teaching and good research. What was the second question, sorry?
The second question is about how must it incorporate the global conscience in its internal governance?
A global conscience.
I suppose what this questioner is meaning is that since there are a number of global social movements, for example, the Black Lives Matter in the US or some other aspects of injustice, including climate change, how does all these competing demands of seeking justice around the world can be incorporated into the internal conversations within a law school?
I don't think that's something that necessarily needs to be done deliberately or by leadership. Leadership's role is to create a space in which those perspectives and those movements can be allowed into law school conversations and to an extent be allowed to flourish. So as long as we've followed some of the advice that we've been discussing earlier around creating safe spaces and within the bounds of not causing harm to others, encouraging freedom of speech and freedom of expression, then I think multiple discourses and perspectives will come into the law school inevitably as individual academics are able to discuss their particular views about, for example, justice or climate change. So our role is not to force everybody to pay attention to these global movements, but rather to create a space in which those movements are allowed to be discussed and debated within the law school.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. Penelope, there's another question, which is, I think, a very interesting one. What lessons learned during the COVID era should law school administrators take forward and implement even in the post-COVID era?
Well, communicate. I think we've learned how to do that in multiple different ways and to keep it going and try and keep people connected. We've probably learned some lessons about how to be more sustainable. So I think that's probably important going forward. And perhaps in some institutions, there was a bit of catching up on the use of technology. And, it was good for us in a way. I mean, it was terrifying and awful at the time, but in many ways, we've probably learned that blended was probably best all along, and we should try for some satisfying face-to-face experiences, but also use the technology better for some of the transmissive, perhaps, elements of our teaching. If I could just jump in on that question of the global conscience. I think Nick's, right that you don't want to force things, but I suppose you can encourage discussions within your faculty about, do we see ourselves as a law school committed to social justice? Or what is the idea of justice that's somehow fundamental to law? How do we promote equality? And increasingly, I think our students actually expect us to talk about sustainability. So I can see that law schools will be doing more to mainstream sustainability and not just have it parked in, say, environmental law. We might be trying to think about other ways we can mainstream it across the curriculum. So I think that question about the global conscience is quite an intriguing one.
Thank you, Dean Mathew. Dean Skead, there is a very interesting question about how does the world of careers potentially going to change, particularly in a post-pandemic world, because all of us know that law schools, there is a certain predictable, aspect of law careers that has happened for a very long time now. And suddenly we are all in a situation where new types of technologies are emerging, new possibilities are emerging within the legal field, and how as a law school dean, we need to take note of it and end up communicating it to our faculty members, students, and even other stakeholders.
That's a fantastic question, and it just so happens that it's something I've been really interrogating over the last, I would say, 6 months in particular, although thinking about it for far longer. And actually, I gave a keynote at a conference last week where I spoke to this particular point, having just come out of a period of extensive and immersive consultation with primarily the employers of our graduates. And what was really interesting when probing what it is they're looking for in law graduates and what we should be doing as law schools in response to this apparent shift to automation was and it's to use the phrase that Nick used earlier, and it is really back to basics. Our students, regardless of what technologies might come and go, and they do come and go really quite quickly, it is important that law schools maintain academic rigor, that students are firmly grounded in fundamentals and principles, but also that they then have the ability during their time with us to develop the skills and the attributes and the values that the community and the profession more broadly is looking for. And those are around, the basic lawyering skills like legal reasoning and critical thinking, but also things like perseverance and adaptability and work ethic and inclusivity and cultural competence. And so just being aware that yes, we're moving into a technologically very exciting and interesting legal landscape, but that doesn't mean that we should be losing sight of the fundamentals of what a really high quality legal education is, and that's around fundamental understanding, but also values and attributes.
Thank you, Dean Skead. Dean Suherman, I would like you to answer the same question, but also briefly reflect on the idea of how do we develop that collective conscience among our students when it comes to responding to issues of justice around the world.
Okay, about justice issue, you mean?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think if we talk about technology and also about the conscience, the about how to react, how to behave against the injustice or justice system in the world. I think as law students and also lecturer in Faculty of Law should very concerned with values, with justice, and also all the something like in Indonesia, there's a local wisdom that need more to be elaborate, because the local wisdom, local value as well in Indonesia have kinds of good contribution to our universal values, like also to how to make the world more in more fair, kind of fair, more fair, and also more good condition, how to manage conflict and also dispute between the society, and also many things. I think in our campus, because we concerned with our local wisdom and how to push our local wisdom to be more access in global area like that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I can only say that what a fascinating discussion I have had the privilege to have with all of you. I would like to once again extend my heartiest congratulations and gratitude to Professor Nick James, Professor Penelope, Elise, Mathew, Professor Natalie, Skead, and Professor Maman, Suherman for joining us in this summit. I do strongly believe that your own personal leadership and commitment to institution building, and in that process providing transformative legal education, is inspiring a lot of young people. And I sincerely hope that we will have opportunities to meet in India or elsewhere. In the meantime, be safe and take care. And thank you very much for joining us in this Global Law School Summit on the theme Global Law Deans, the Changing Pattern of Law School Administration.